I'll be talking today about Rails 3.1, and my name is Ben Scheirman. I spoke here at Lone Star last year, and the Thursday when I came in town, I started to get sick, and last year I had just the raspiest voice, and I couldn't participate in the bar conversations, and by the time my talk came up, I could barely speak at all. So when I came down this time, I started to feel that scratchy throat again, and so anyway, luckily it's not as bad as last year, but this is sort of like the Lone Star tradition that Ben's going to feel sick around this time. So apologize for that. So a little bit about me. I'm the Director of Development for Chai1 in Houston, Texas. We do iOS and Rails. We're looking for some people, so if you do iOS, Rails, or Android, let me know. I like to drink beer and play guitar, so I think I'm in good company here. There, you can find me on Twitter, Subdigital, and on my blog at flux88.com. All right, so Rails 3.1. If we take a look at what Rails 3 did, Rails 3 brought to the table, we saw a lot of componentization, the merging of the MERB project, and basically everything became pluggable. Well, Rails 3.1 is what I like to call the return of opinions release. And there's some pretty strong opinions in Rails 3.1. So for a dot release, it's actually quite significant. So I'm going to go over what's new, and then we're going to drill into each one of these sections. So first, and probably the least controversial, jQuery is now the default. We also have reversible migrations, mountable engines, the identity map, prepared statements, has secure password, HTTP streaming, the asset pipeline, CoffeeScript, and SASS. Okay, so this is fairly innocuous. Basically, you have a new line in your gem file for jQuery Rails. And if you're one of those few people that are still holdouts for prototype, you can still uncomment that gem and add prototype Rails to your gem file, and everything will be fine. We also have reversible migrations now. And reversible migrations is fairly an obvious idea. Our old migrations had an up and a down method, so if you created the table in the up method, you'd have to drop the table in the down method. Now we just have a change method. And for most changes, it's pretty obvious what the opposite of this is going to be. If you create a table, then the down method is actually going to drop the table for you. So that's a good change. Less code to write. We also have mountable engines. So an engine is like a Rails plugin that contains all of these things: controllers, models, views, routes, initializers, and assets. So it's like another Rails application that you can embed inside of your Rails application. So if you have an engine, you can embed it inside of two different applications. So what's important about this is that it contains assets as well as views. So you can have your own JavaScript, CSS, images, and things like that, and you can embed those into other Rails apps. Like, for example, the Rescue admin console. It's really easy to just embed that as a nested engine in your application. So creating an engine is pretty easy. You say Rails plugin new, the name of your engine, and you pass in -- mountable. And it'll generate an app that looks pretty much like any Rails app, as well as a gem spec. That'll also create this engine class for you, and this is how you embed it in a containing application. So you open up routes.rb, and you say mount my engine, and then that's the path in our application that we're going to be used to access that engine. So basically, it's just a rack application, so Rails is going to take that route and pass it off to the other application. So that engine can have its own route file and process things from there. Next up is the identity map. So the identity map is common in other ORMs. If you've ever used Hibernate or NHibernate or Entity Framework, any of these other things, they all have an identity map. And Active Record now has one. So if you call customer.find, that's actually going to execute a statement against the database. It's going to put an object in memory. If we do the exact same statement again, it'll definitely get cached. But we're left with another object in memory. Now, if you were to take customer 1 and customer 2 and do equal comparison on them, it'll return yes, or return true, because they're overriding the equality operator and they're comparing the primary key. But it's two separate objects in memory. What the identity map does is it will return the same object in memory, so you're always dealing with the same exact memory location. So you can imagine that that could trim down long-running processes or big fat controllers that use a lot of methods, or maybe you're just doing some batch stuff in the console. But you have to use it with caution. It turns out that this kind of breaks some complex relationships in certain scenarios, so it's off by default. So if you want to turn it on, you can do this in an application.rb, config.enable identity map equal true. Or if you just want to use it in one case, you can say active record : identity map.use, and inside the block, everything in there gets to use the identity map. One way that you can verify this in the Rails console to see if it's working or not, since equals will tell you that the objects are the same, compare their object IDs and they will be different. If you're using the identity map, the object IDs will be identical. Next up is prepared statements. Does anybody here use SQL Server? A couple people? Okay. You guys will like this one. Okay, so let's say we have a query here. Select star from customers where ID is 128. And we have the same query with a different parameter. That'll result in two different query plans on SQL Server. Just by the nature of how it was configured, how the driver was configured for Rails. What prepared statements does is it takes that statement and caches it and sends a token for that statement along with the parameters. So you're sending less text to the database and you're reusing stuff. So what does that mean? SQL Server got, I heard some stat on the internet, 10 times performance improvement. I didn't find anything to validate that, but big thumbs up for SQL Server. It's definitely a big win there. We had small wins for SQLite and Postgres. Unfortunately, MySQL performance just degraded with this turned on. It looks like they already have some sort of this type of optimization present in MySQL. And by adding the extra call to the database to prepare the statements, you're doing some redundant calls or whatever. So they just disable it if you're using the MySQL adapter. Has secure password. What is your favorite authentication system? If you're starting a new project, which one are you going to use? Okay. Anybody use Devise? Okay. AuthLogic? Okay. I've had pain with all of these at some point or another. It seems to be there's a lot of magic, and eventually you understand the magic, and then things become productive until you upgrade to Rails 3 and everything breaks. And then Ryan Bates on Railscast said, it's pretty easy to roll your own. And after watching that, I agree with him. Especially now, we have a has secure password on active model. So if we have a users table and we add a password digest column, and in our user model, we say has secure password, what does that give us? It gives us virtual accessors for two new attributes called password and password confirmation. Then we call save on that user. It uses bcrypt to encrypt the password and store it in that password digest column. And then we can call the user.authenticate method, passing in an incorrect password that will return false. And if we authenticate with the correct password, that will return the user itself. So you have a really easy way of find the user by some unique identifier, like their username, and then try to authenticate that user based on the password provided, and that's it. So has secure password is a big win, and it makes it even easier to just roll your own authentication system. All right, so HTTP streaming. Just about every major web framework, with the exception of Rails, does some sort of HTTP streaming, and the reason is performance. So let's take a look at a scenario here without HTTP streaming. The client makes a call to the server. The server does a render step, renders a template, and sends that back to the client, at which point the client detects that there are some assets it needs to go fetch, and then it can go fetch those assets. Then it'll return the asset, render the page, and everything is fine. With HTTP streaming, you call get items. The server is busy rendering, but as soon as it finishes a certain section, it may send it to you. At that point, the client notices that there's some assets we can grab. And then the render step finishes, and the resulting HTML is sent. So the net time from start to end is almost identical in both of these cases, except for the fact that the client was able to start the request for the JavaScript and images and CSS earlier. So let's take a look at how that works. All right, so I'm going to take a look at my Rails version here. Can everybody read this? Or should I make it a little bigger? A little bigger? All right. Okay, so Rails 3.1 is actually on RC5 right now. I expect it to be released like very, very soon. And so I'm going to just say Rails new, and I'll call this application Streamer. Then we wait for the dreaded bundle install on the conference network. And yeah, I need some elevator music during this step. All right, I may have to pull out my ready-made turkey in the other oven while that's happening. There it goes. Okay, so we have a Rails 3 application. I'm going to open that up. And we're going to take a look at the gem file. You can't use HTTP streaming with the built-in WebRick web server. So we can use Unicorn. And I'm going to add some configuration here. Into config unicorn.development.rb. Oops, I've got to go into my folder. Okay, so now that we have that, I need to make sure that I have that bundle installed. Okay, so now that we have Unicorn, I can type Unicorn Rails, config file, and then pass it config unicorn development.rb. And now we've got our web server running. So let's check it out and make sure it works. Okay, it's working. So now I'm going to just create a basic controller in action. And inside here, we're going to go to the view. Whoops. Yeah, can you tell I'm a little bit new to Vim? Okay. So here I'm going to just render some text. And then I'm going to simulate some sort of complex rendering going on, right? So I'm calling sleep inside of my view. If I now go to demo streaming, notice how it's sitting there for quite a long time and finally comes back. We can see this problem a little bit easier if we use curl. Right? I'm the client here. I'm waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and finally I get the content back. And that took far too long. So what we can do is go back to the controller, and you can just say stream here at the top. And now if I do curl, notice I get the head tag immediately, and I can go fetch the CSS and JavaScript, and then I get the body tag. Another interesting thing to look at is if you do curl-I to look at the headers. Look at the transfer encoding. It's chunked. So that's new. It's not necessarily new in HTTP terms. It's new to Rails support for it. So every browser will support this. And it's generally a good idea if it works in your environment. You can also do things like this. So I could say render action streaming stream equal true. So if I just want to do it on one action, I can do that as well. Okay, so the goal here is to render the head tag as soon as possible because that allows the client to start fetching those assets. There are a couple of gotchas. If you're using yield with named blocks to provide content for, say, a sidebar or something like that, the way the templates work in Rails is that content for can be called many times, and it just takes all the content, mashes it together, and puts it inside that section. So you have no way of knowing that the render step is completed for a given section. So if you have a named yield tag in your template, it has to wait for the entire thing to finish rendering before we can flush the content. So this diagram is an example of how it is in pre-Rails 3.1, where it just goes through this entire loop. The layout gets the content for each one of these sections, and eventually it finishes, and then we can flush it. But here is what we want to do. We want to have periodic times when we flush the content to the client. And so by doing that, we need a way of providing content for named sections where once that content is provided, we can basically mark that section as done and they can send it. So for that, we want to use a new thing called provide. So say, for example, we're yielding the title here so that templates can then set the title for individual pages. And you just say provide title and pass in a block for the content. So once that is done, then the title can be rendered. And this will work for every single one of the named content blocks on your page. So there are some downsides to this. A whole bunch of rack middleware breaks. So this isn't something that you can just be like, okay, I'm going to turn on my entire application. If you're using any rack middleware that then inspects the response of the call command in rack, that command will very likely return immediately, and the render hasn't finished yet. So for example, if you're trying to time how long the call method takes, and you're going to log that, for example, like this page took X amount of seconds to render, the call method is just going to execute immediately, and that's not going to work. Other rack middleware that breaks are things that actually inject content into the DOM. Those are going to break. And the reason is rack just wasn't built with this in mind. Rack is a clumsy API for dealing with streaming. So there's definitely some work to be done before streaming becomes, prime time. But it's easy to try and see if it breaks. Okay, next up is the asset pipeline. So you have an application. It's got a whole bunch of JavaScript, CSS, and images. So we'll look at the JavaScript case. This is a screenshot from a project that I worked on. The thing that's underlined there is the only line of JavaScript that I wrote, or the only file in JavaScript that I wrote. Everything else is third party, but they all sort of have to go in the same folder. Now, why did I put all of those JavaScript that I wrote, my JavaScript, in one file? Well, the biggest reason is because if you're using YSlow, this is one of the first recommendations you're going to get is to make fewer HTTP requests. I already have a whole lot of HTTP requests just to pull down these files. Another thing to look at is minifying, so that these things aren't taking up as much space. So this is where sprockets came into play, and sprockets is now included as a dependency in Rails 3.1. So what sprockets does is it takes all these assets, and it runs them through, concatenates them all together in a sensible order, then squishes them down, and then the resulting file is what you include in your page. So let's take a look at that. So I already have this application built, and I won't bore you with watching bundle install run again, so I'll just do it in here. Let's add another action into our controller here. I'll just call it pipeline. All right, so say we have two divs. One of them is fancy box. And the other one is classy box. To make sure that that works, we can go to demo pipeline, and oops, I need a route for that. Wrong one. That's the one. Okay, so now what I want to do is, if we take a look at the application, we have this new folder called Assets inside of our application directory. Inside there we have images, JavaScripts, and style sheets, and we have a couple of things in here. So I'm just going to open up the one that it already created for me when I generated my controller, and we're going to add some styles in here. So let's see, I want my the box to have, you know, some padding, margin. I want the fancy one to have sort of a large font size and a fancy font. And this one's going to have a fancy color. And the classy one's going to be a little bit different. So okay, so nothing incredibly crazy here, but now we have some styles. Now, if we take a look at the source of this page, that demo.css file isn't anywhere to be found. And so it allows me to take styles that are just relevant to that page. I don't want to muddy up some common page or common file of style sheets to provide styles that are for this. But Sprockets has concatenated them all for me. So what that means is you'll have one request for CSS, one request for JavaScript. Notice I also have one for JavaScript, and if I take a look in there, that includes jQuery and anything else I've included. So to drive this home a little bit more, in JavaScript, I can add a new file here. So let me app assets JavaScripts demo.js, and I will do div.box.click function $this.fadeout. And if I've done it correctly, when I click on it, they fade out. So nothing too fancy here. It's just that these files are getting concatenated for us, which is really, really handy. It's also skipping that squishing step that I talked about in development. So it's easy to take a look at the files and see if something's wrong. For example, if you have a JavaScript error. So there is a gotcha. Sprockets requires a server-side JavaScript environment. So on Heroku, this can cause problems. So for Heroku, you're going to want to add the Ruby Racer Heroku gem. Sorry, that's kind of hard to read. And 0.8.1.3 is the latest version that works on Rails 3.1. Okay. One little commit, include CoffeeScript in gem file, on April 13th, resulted in this. Can anybody tell me what this is? The longest comment thread in GitHub's system. I will zoom in on it for you. Yeah, it was an innocent commit message, and it resulted in all of this. And you have your regular meme images popping through here. It's like, I'm freaking out. They have the. Anyway, it's a good read. You should definitely check it out. And you can tell that you leave Rails alone. There was that image in there. It's pretty good read. So people seem to care about this decision way too deeply. So deeply, in fact, people are asking, do I have to use CoffeeScript, which would lead to the website, do I have to use CoffeeScript in Rails.com, which says yes. Just kidding. I'm not kidding about the website, but it says just kidding on the website. So if you don't want to use CoffeeScript, you don't have to use CoffeeScript, but it is now included by default. So what is CoffeeScript? I don't want to stomp too much on the other session, which is probably going to be way more involved than this one. I don't know if that's later today or tomorrow, but there is a session on CoffeeScript. But basically, CoffeeScript is a mini language that compiles down to JavaScript. It's not that unlike JavaScript. It just takes away a whole lot of the punctuation and gives you some of your Rubyisms that you really like. For example, you have no var keyword anymore. Everything is implicit. The var is implicit. There's no semicolons. You don't have the word function littered throughout all of your files 10,000 times. And this is just scratching the surface. I mean, this is just the syntax. There's some really cool language features called comprehensions that can make your code really, really terse but powerful. So this is basically what that function was that I wrote earlier. And that turns into this. So the word function goes away completely, and the body of the function is denoted by the little dash arrow, which it's sort of out in the community of what people want to call this. Why the Lucky Stiff called these stabby arrows, which I think is kind of cool. Dash rocket is probably the most common, but stabby arrows, maybe I'll just say that. And arguments to the method go in parentheses before the stabby arrow. If you have no arguments to the method, then you don't need the parentheses. And then from then on, I'm just using jQuery. So it's basically the same code. It's easy to read. It's white space sensitive, though. So you have no end block. You have no closing brace. I highly recommend the CoffeeScript video on Peepcode. I just went through it last week, and it's fantastic. And I'm just going to skip over that one. This is the class syntax for CoffeeScript. So, I know JavaScript pretty well. I know about the prototype inheritance model and how to do it. I have to look it up every time I need it, and therefore I don't really do it that often. It's just a whole lot of code, and it's stuff that I don't really remember. CoffeeScript, on the other hand, can generate that for me with a much more sensible syntax. So this is a class animal with a constructor. And You can see we've got some string interpolation going on right here, which is pretty awesome. And you have inheritance. So snake extends animal, it slithers, and the horse gallops. Pretty straightforward. Now on to SASS. You saw earlier that I wrote CSS in a file that was named SCSS. SASS is fully CSS supported, so anything that you write today, you can just copy and paste into a SCSS file and it will work. So let's examine a sample CSS file real quick, and then we'll talk about what SASS can do for you. So let's say we have some sort of content container. It's got a margin. It's got a background color of some gray, and it's got rounded corners. And we're just using 2 of the probably 3 or 4 styles we might choose to use for rounded corners, right? So this will work in Firefox and Chrome and Safari. Then we have H1 inside of there that's going to be some color red. It's got a background. It also needs the same sort of duplication of the radius stuff, albeit with a different pixel radius. And then we have some nested stuff in here. Again, that color is duplicated. And now I need to provide the hover style for that A tag, so now I've got to duplicate all that prefix stuff again and do hover. And if I was really being good CSS citizen, I would do A:link and A:active also, otherwise we might end up with those purple links that are the default styling. So if you take a look, I've sort of circled things that are related to each other, almost dependent on each other. If I change the header color, I probably also want to change the one in the link. And the background color of the A hover style is a derivative of that red color. It's a lighter red. This is what we can do with SASS. You can tell it's more code because my white space increased, but it's definitely, you'll start to see the benefits. So the first thing is we have some variables, right, for the color, the highlight color and the background color. And then I denote something called a mix-in, called rounded corners, that looks like it takes a radius variable. And then I define those styles that I was talking about earlier inside this. You can think of this like a function. So now in my content definition, I can include that mix-in by saying @include and just call it like as if it were JavaScript. Now what am I doing here? Instead of duplicating content H1 like I did in the other one as a separate style, SASS allows you to nest these things. So I'm nesting the H1 inside the content definition. Now I'm using the colors here, one for the background and one for the foreground color, but I'm using a color function that's built into SASS. So I just want to take that background color, I want to darken it by 10%. And again, the rounded corners with the different parameter passed in. So you can kind of see the what's going on here for our hover style on the A tag. We're using that color function again to lighten that highlight color a little bit. And so this basically allows me to change the background color in one place and the highlight color in one place, and everything else is derivative of that, which is a pretty big win. Okay, real quick on SASS, there is another syntax that looks a lot like Haml. It's white space sensitive. If you're a fan of Haml, you might be a fan of that. I'm a fan of Haml, and I hate the SASS syntax because the SASS syntax looks just like the HTML markup, so much so that I get confused at what I'm looking at. So I definitely prefer the SCSS syntax, but there is that option if you choose. All right, any questions? Yeah.
On the SASS, if you had multiple files, how do you know what order you're loading them in so you can have the variables?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, if you have multiple files and you have variables in those files, you probably need those to be registered in a certain order so the variables exist when a later file needs to use it. If you take a look in, I may take away a little bit of the magic here by showing you this. But if you take a look in application.css. There's these weird little comments here. And this is Sprockets looking at this and saying, okay, I'm going to require self and then require everything in this folder. So if you needed something to be used ahead of time, then you would probably add in require and then variables.css.scss, something like that.
Now it's still in the same folder?
Yeah, and that would load it first. So you have to do something a little bit manual to get that ordering to happen. And sometimes it is important to make sure that some styles are referenced before the others. And I don't think that this require tree does in any sensible order. It's not alphabetic or anything like that. So you may end up having to require stuff manually. In addition, you may be able to put some of that stuff in here, although this file itself isn't pre-processed. So I'm not sure if you can change this to SCSS or not, the application.css file. Any other questions? Yeah.
So in a lot of production environments, you're serving static resources on Apache or Linux or whatever. Is there a way to generate these assets and tie into some kind of designer for some type of environments?
So you're serving them from a separate application from your Rails app, or is this just in a different?
Right, it might be served by something from Mountable or something like that.
Yeah, if you take a look in the temp folder, there's some stuff in here. I'm not exactly sure where it is, maybe in cache assets, and you can pull out the files that are generated. And there's some configuration. I mean, Sprockets existed before Rails 3.1. And so you actually had to run this as a watcher anyway to generate the files and then manually take those files and reference them in your application. So you could easily write a rake script that takes those files and puts them on another server. Yeah. Yes?
Rails 3 had an engine thing, so how is this different?
The engines thing? Yeah, so Rails 3 had engines. This one allows you to plug into the asset pipeline, the same. And I'm not sure if that was present in Rails 3. And I was watching the Railscast video on Mountable Engines, and Ryan Bates mentioned that just in RC5 they fixed some breaking issue that made it possible to use them. He didn't mention what the issue was, so that's why I didn't mention it. Any other questions? Is everybody ready to go install Rails 3.1 now? Living on the edge? Okay, thank you very much.